To be here. And thank you to the participants for joining. So this talk is based on 2 articles on migration and my book, Misreading the Bengal Delta, Climate Change Development and Livelihoods in Coastal Bangladesh, where I discuss the inextricable entwinement of climate and capitalism. The monograph argues that current climate adaptation projects are based on the same capitalist modes of production as in the past that exacerbate environmental crisis, and this includes flood protection embankments, tiger prawn cultivation in brackish waters, as well as high-yielding agrochemical-dependent agriculture. And my articles on migration are based on a dissertation chapter that I left out of the book. But they're also a very important part of the story of misreading climate change in Bangladesh. And this is the first time I'm bringing them back together after many years. So they've shaped my thinking, as well as a recently co-written chapter with Alessandro Ripa, where we discuss how climatic environmental changes structure both human and non-human mobilities. So in this talk, I'll first start off by discussing key ideas in the book, including the concept of climate reductive translations that I develop and how these result in various misreadings of environmental problems in the Bengal Delta. I'll specifically focus on the first 2 chapters of my book that deals with misreading floods, and then talk about chapter 4 and the misreading of food security, to end with a discussion of climate reductive translations of migration, which also draws much on the problems of tiger prawns discussed in chapter 3 of the book. So how did I come to this research, you may wonder? In the autumn of 2011, I was finishing 12 months of qualitative research on an internationally funded water governance project in Bangladesh's coastal zone. My field trips drew my attention to several urgent problems that our rural interlocutors had raised, from saline tiger prawn cultivation that weakened flood protection embankments and destroyed agricultural soils, to canals like this one that filled up with heavy sediment each year, causing the canals and rivers to die. So this is a morakal, a dead canal. And this canal used to be so wide that steamers would pass it. It used to be a river, and now it's just a dying canal. So I sought to explore these issues further in a new project and began asking fellow researchers I met during the year how to best pursue this. When I mentioned my interest in land use and siltation when I mentioned my interest in land use and siltation to a colleague, they mentioned the increasing amount of financial support for climate change research and proposed that the title of my research proposal ought to mention climate change. Although I followed this advice, I wondered whether this inclusion of climate change deflected attention away from the most pressing concerns that arose during my previous study. So climate change has become a buzzword used to attract donor funding, but to what extent do climate-funded projects address coastal vulnerabilities and needs? In my research, I study climate change by investigating climate change knowledge production in development aid projects. How does the idea of climate change shape direction of development interventions in the global south? To what extent do these interventions correspond with the concerns of the people they're seeking to help? Can climate change as a development buzzword help save the rivers and canals of the Bengal Delta? And in regards to the theme of mobility, what are the risks of climate change discourses distorting understandings of practices of mobility in areas deemed as climate hotspots? I returned to Bangladesh in 2014 to explore these questions further. On World Rivers Day, I attended a workshop organized by grassroots environmental movement in Khulna City. The event was at the basement of a concrete building, the parking lot. Instead of cars, the space was filled with rows of plastic chairs facing a table with a large poster with the words "Save Our Rivers" in Bangla hanging above it. There was no fan, no air conditioning. It was a development meeting conducted entirely in Bangla, with no presence of English-speaking international experts or donors. One of the participants, Mr. Shahid, said, "Climate change shopje darun mashallah." Climate change is the most amazing spice. Add climate change, poverty alleviation, and gender, and you will have a recipe for success for your development project. But will this recipe help save the river? Mr. Shahid's use of climate change as a spice here was one that kept reoccurring during my fieldwork amongst different development practitioners. Climate Change as a Spice illustrates how local Bangladeshi development professionals act as development brokers and translators. This means that they're social actors that actively build social, political, and economic roles and partake in development assemblages, where they translate the meta code of climate change in distinctively different ways. Or put in simpler terms, they use climate change as a spice to strip out context in ways that appeal to donors. By translation, I do not mean translating climate change from one language to another, but translation as the processes by which development brokers make projects real by creating a story that establishes a causal chain of logic to the prevailing policy theory, which in this case is that Bangladesh will drown due to rising sea levels caused by global warming. Climate reductive translations thus help conceptualize how different climate projects produce coherence. That is, create causal narratives linking their particular development intervention to the policy theory of climate change. And here I argue that climate reductive translations result in different kinds of misreadings. And misreading is taken from Misreading the African Landscape by James Fairhead and Melissa Leach, who talk about reading the landscape backwards in the sense of, in the African landscape, attributing deforestation to villagers and reading the present through the past. To apply this in the Bengal Delta, to read the landscape backward is to assume that all environmental problems Bangladesh is facing today are caused by climate change. So in my book and in this article, I developed the concept of climate reductive translations, which draws on Mike Hume's concept of climate reductionism. And climate reductionism refers to the increasing tendency to attribute all changes in environment and society to climate. So what I'm trying to do with the concept of climate reductive translations is to highlight how the policy theory in Bangladeshi climate change projects tend to be climate reductive, that the country will drown due to rising sea levels caused by global warming. And with translations, that is trying to show more about the dynamic interactions and effects that this can have. So how different development actors, Bangladeshi, international, different types of NGOs, donors, government authorities, etc., how they come together to use climate change as a spice to attract funding by linking their particular intervention or project to the policy theory of climate change. They create a causal narrative of how climate change is causing a problem that their particular organization is equipped to solve. So in other words, climate reductive translations help to conceptualize how radically different adaptation interventions in Bangladesh can take shape and the problematic misreadings that they may also give rise to, including misreading floods, food security, and how this all may contribute to migration. But to understand climate reductive translations of floods, and indeed how embankments worsen floodings, as well as how people are perhaps not necessarily climate refugees fleeing sea level rise, I think it's important to look at the environmental history of embankments in this area. So embankments in the Sundarbans region started off as temporary earthen embankments as mangrove was converted into agrarian lands. So these were earthen bunds, very temporary, made of local mud to stop saline intrusion during the dry season, not to stop monsoon floods. And with the 1793 Permanent Settlement Act, revenue collection increased, and to avoid paying taxes, more landowners kept clearing more of the Sundarbans. So you can see here, here's the 1779 boundary of the Sundarbans, and this is the 1874 one. So deforestation happened quite rapidly, resulting in that by 1874, a significant part of the Sundarbans had become cleared and much closer to the Bay of Bengal. So these earthen bunds, archival sources show, were necessary to prevent the reclaimed lands turning back into Sundarbans forest, or what was considered wastelands at the time by the colonial administrators. And up until this point, monsoon or Bosha inundations were described as blessings of fertility for Bengal. Rather than stopping these inundations of wetlands, earthen bunds were broken during the monsoon to flood the land with river mixed with rainwater for paddy irrigation. And the Bosha rainwater merged with the silt-laden river water to deposit silt on the floodplains. And the silt raised the land levels and promoted processes of organic decomposition that make deltaic lands fertile. These inundated wetlands, in turn, were or are the breeding grounds for hundreds of spawning fish species and help irrigate rice planted during the monsoon season. And before each dry season, the bunds would be rebuilt again to stop the rivers that by now had turned saline from entering into the fields again. And such maintenance work was decentralized under the East India Company, with the landowner or whoever cleared the land organizing workers to keep up these embankments. In view of this, the narrative that all floods must be prevented is highly problematic. Allowing monsoon Bosha inundations inside these wetlands was a key way of ensuring that silt that came with rivers originating from the Himalayas, but this silt, this 1 billion ton of silt each year, did not choke up the rivers, but could deposit in raised lands. And we'll get back to this. So in the book, I discuss how during the British Raj, centralized government started building permanent embankments as annual repairs of these earthen dikes were costly. And to justify such large expenditure, the official colonial narrative emphasized that it was the state's responsibility to protect life and property from damaging floods. In this narrative, the monsoon Bosha inundation was cast as destructive, so to justify state endeavors to prevent or repair breaches to the embankments. The colonial administration designed and constructed watertight embankments along the Damodar River to prevent wholesale breaches to reduce maintenance costs. The embankments and bridges, as Iftikhar Iqbal writes about, traversed across the many crisscrossing rivers and canals of the Bengal Delta, enabling the construction of colonial railways and roads atop of them, thereby dividing the Delta into innumerable compartments. And this new type of embankment, easier to control and requiring less repair, simplified the dynamics of floods and monsoons. It was promoted as a scientific technology that would modernize Bengal, and it was tied to considerable capitalist interests working together with the colonial administration. It was intimately tied to the expansion of railways in Bengal. And this is a history I've been spending the past decade trying to understand. And it is quite fascinating because prior to 1850, there were no railways and few roads in Bengal. Mobility actually occurred through waters. In 1875, riverine traffic was extensive with boat routes connecting the entire Bengal region. Traditional waterways were affordable and accessible for local people. It was the main mode of transport. Sir Arthur Cotton was a famous British irrigation engineer with 5 decades of experience on India's irrigation systems. In 1872, he emphasized to the House of Parliament that India demanded water carriage and pointed out that this was much more cost-effective than railways. He argued that the preference for railways comes from utter ignorance of India and her needs, but this was rejected. Capitalist railway interests in London worked together with the colonial administration under the guise of high modernist ideology, to borrow from James Scott, to expand railways for goods and military purposes, despite the strong objections of those with local knowledge. These historical infrastructural choices of choosing roads and rails over waterways as a mode of mobility laid the foundation to many of the water-related problems wetlands in South Asia are currently having to reckon with. Although I build on Scott's seeing like a state, I also discuss how the state comprises of different units and actors that do not have the same interests or agenda, and suggest that concepts such as climate reductive translations and development assemblages can help us account for such heterogeneity within the state. Oh, what happened here? There we go. Oshtomashi bands continued in the Sundarbans region despite railway construction elsewhere. After the 1947 partition, this region was in chaos. And a survey and settlement report in the 50s described how these new borders were quite sudden. All the British officials had left from the irrigation department, while the landowners, the zamindars that had been in charge of Ashtomashi Bands had left for India, leaving a vacancy. So there was very little management going on, and the Bands were in a state of disrepair. Breaches were abundant, and salinity intrusion crept into the fields, while several large floods during the 50s harmed agricultural crops. So the UN Krug mission was part of establishing the Coastal Embankment Project in the 1960s. This was funded by the USAID, the World Bank, and the UN with the aid of Dutch consultants, modeled after Dutch polders. And similar embankments were proposed in the 1990s in the Flood Action Plan. And all these embanked floodplains, so these are numbers of various embankments. There are these lines going around them. And all of these embanked floodplains are referred to as polders in Bangladesh. What I want to highlight here is that the construction of donor-funded flood protection embankments obstructed the beneficial Bosha floods inundations critical for fertile agriculture, irrigation, and breeding grounds for fish I mentioned earlier. Instead, it trapped silt in the outside river. So the resulting difference in elevation resulted in a raised riverbed and a sunken floodplain, which when heavy monsoon rains happen, they cannot drain out back to the river and thus cause what is also known as jolobodho floods or drainage congestion, waterlogging. It's important to note here that areas in southwest Bangladesh enclosed by the coastal embankment project embankments have lost 1 to 1.5 meters of elevation, while the neighboring unembanked Sundarbans mangrove are gaining elevation due to sediment deposited through monsoon flooding. Natural scientists conclude that riverbed sedimentation in Bangladesh caused by the embankments pose a greater threat of coastal flooding than predicted sea level rise in the future. Despite the well-known and long-standing problems caused by these flood protection embankments since the 80s, the World Bank has spent 400 million on a project to build wider and higher embankments in Bangladesh since 2012. And this is also a big feature of the Delta Development Plan Bangladesh is undertaking with the Netherlands. And the World Bank project is based on a project rationale that embankments stop floods and that this constitutes climate change adaptation. The World Bank project documents do not mention siltation or the connection between flood protection and the silting up of important water bodies. The logic is that 1, sea levels will rise and cyclones will increase in frequency and intensity. 2, this will lead to devastating floods and salinity in Bangladesh. And 3, the best way to protect Bangladesh is to build larger embankments. The CEIP, or the Coastal Embankment Improvement Project that the World Bank is using, translates embankments as climate adaptation infrastructure, and it's extremely problematic since higher and wider flood protection embankments will only worsen siltation that chokes up rivers and canals, as well as exacerbate damaging jolobodho floods, as well as the risk of disastrous floods such as Bonna that happen during high tidal surges and cyclones. So coastal Bangladesh's low-lying topography is often depicted by media, donors, and even scholars as particularly vulnerable to rising sea levels. With this environmental history of embankments, I want to emphasize how floods in Bangladesh are not solely about climatic change, and not all kinds of floods must be prevented. In a delta known for its heavy sedimentation, attributing all floods to rising sea levels due to melting ice caps caused by climate change is really problematic. It's a climate reductive translation of floods that stops us discussing how to actually deal with these infrastructures that increase problems of silt destroying wetlands and thus reducing their water retention capacities. And so this image of a climate refugee is a typical image of jolobodho waterlogging during the monsoon, when water is unable to drain out through an embankment and back into the river. It's caused by infrastructure such as embankments that stop beneficial monsoon flooding by stopping silt from depositing on wetlands. So migration due to waterlogging are therefore not really climate induced, but a result of almost a century of poor infrastructure that have contributed to really a poor situation of silt management of the delta. So long-term solutions against waterlogging that increase the water retention capacities of rivers and canals are of urgent importance, especially due to the unreliability of the monsoon with longer dry seasons and more excess water during the monsoon. So the World Bank's project actively avoided the issue of siltation and erosion in the delta, but by no means am I claiming that climate change projects in my field site were part of an all-powerful development discourse that sought to render siltation invisible. Rather, with the concept of climate reductive translations, I'm trying to draw attention to the diversity of interest and objectives of different assemblages of development brokers that may actually use climate change as a spice in ways that benefit local people. For example, while conducting fieldwork in Nodi, I met with a WASH NGO, a Water and Sanitation Hygiene NGO. The senior officer, Bodrul, pitched the project in English as if I was a prospective donor and argued that the project would improve the situation of livelihoods in a climatic vulnerable area through safe drinking water and latrines. I asked him in Bangla why they had climate in their project title and how this is linked to water and sanitation. He replied back in Bangla saying, to be honest with you, there's no real link between climate change and WASH, but we need to put climate change on everything. You see, the total amount of global development funding has not increased, but climate change is getting more funds diverted to it. For us to continue with the work that still needs to be done, we need to change our masala. Hygiene has been an important part of the international development agenda for a long time, but to continue with it, we need to twist the way we sell it. And so here, as Mr. Shahid observed, Bodrul used climate change as a spice, and safe drinking water is a major concern in my field site and throughout the Southwest coastal region. So with this focus on climate reductive translations, I'm trying to move away from ideas of climate adaptation as a sort of anti-politics machine or a regime that imposes itself on Bangladesh, but rather that climate change as a spice is dynamic, and its result will depend on the actors that work together in creating a project, and their translation may or may not be locally relevant. And this is an image of a climate adaptation project funded by Brazil and Japan that was locally popular. It provided local jobs to landless people, and it widened and deepened heavily silted canals that would result in greater absorption capacity of monsoon rains. And it could also be used for local irrigation and for fish. So this and the WASH NGO shows ingenuity in making locally relevant solutions. So what is important, I think, is how to get siltation and the health of water bodies into the agenda so that we do not engage in climate reductive translations of environmental processes that misread complex waterscapes and social processes. And here I'm extremely concerned with climate reductive translations of migration that I'll go into in terms of believing that these environmental changes are inevitable due to climate change and people must move. I think that is very dangerous and something we can discuss in the Q&A. So another climate reductive translation that I discuss regards food security. And in chapter 4, I discuss how several donors now also translate capital-intensive agricultural technologies as adaptation to climate change. I show how this logic is a continuation of activities pushed on Bangladesh throughout the Cold War and through donor imposition of structural adjustment policies. By examining critical histories of colonial famines and the Green Revolution, it allows us to rethink Bangladesh as a Malthusia, where food supply must be increased to feed a growing and starving population. But whether climate change adaptation projects can benefit local people or not depends on how climate change adaptation is translated in the shaping of a particular development intervention, which itself depends on the composition of donors and their implementing partners. So the different activities of these two projects demonstrate how climate change as a spice is actively translated with varying results in terms of the way they create local benefits. And the final chapter in my book, Surviving Inequality, gives voice to the main livelihood concerns of my interlocutors in Nodi, mainly landless single mothers, and how they perceive coastal vulnerabilities, and that this has little to no relation to climatic change, but to broader issues of social inequalities, structural violence, and issues of underemployment and income opportunities. And this takes us also to the issue of migration and the many political and economic reasons for which women migrate, and how important kinship and affective relations are in shaping women's migration choices. Like floods, riverbank erosion is not a new phenomenon causing vulnerability in the Bengal Delta. Nevertheless, such erosion is increasingly cast as being caused by climate change. And this is arguably a climate reductive translation of migration, since the Ganges River has meandered eastwards for millennia, eroding land, riverbanks, and now flood protection embankments as it changes its course. Riverbank erosion has also played an important role in shaping land revenue policies from Mughal to colonial times. For instance, O'Malley writes in 1908 that the streams are constantly eating away on one bank and depositing on the other until the channel in which they formerly flowed becomes choked up. Riverbank erosion, or Nodi Bhangong, is damaging and disruptive, ruining water-sided road or embankments, causing those who live on top or outside them to lose their homes and move away. But it is also a geological feature of the Bengal Delta. Thus, short-term environmental shocks like riverbank erosion does not itself constitute climate change, nor are riverbank displaced peoples necessarily climate migrants, as other colleagues have also noted. My interlocutors perceived riverbank erosion as a part of the course of the river. And this displacement is one they have seen for generations, resulting in people having to migrate. And this forms part of a wider political problem of regular land loss in a context of land fragmentation and a growing population. Another climate reductive translation of migration from southwest coast of Bangladesh casts people migrating from tiger prawn or shrimp producing villages as climate migrants. Migration in the wake of cyclones is inextricably linked to brackish shrimp farming and the condition of flood protection embankments. Salinity is seasonal in Bangladesh, and the original purpose of flood protection embankments, as I mentioned, was to keep out salt water during the dry season. However, this is reversed with tiger prawn cultivation that requires that the sluice gates of embankments are kept open in the dry season, whereas shrimp businessmen drill several unauthorized pipes into the embankment to flood agricultural land with salt, weakening them. So here in this map, you can see all these red dots. These are illegal pipes, cuts, and other structures that have been inserted into the embankment that my previous project had mapped. This is not my old field site, but I show this to you just to illustrate how material shrimp cultivation is and its impact on these embankments. And even Bangladeshi migration researchers engage in climate reductive translations, because when they said that they were doing climate-related research, I questioned that, and they admitted, and they said, to quote, "The main reason why the flooding was so devastating during Cyclone Ayla in 2009 was due to the care the shrimp damages upon the embankments. Though the devastation was caused by a cyclone, the impact would have been less without cares." So even though they knew this, these researchers recast the migration following Ayla as climate-related migration and were able to obtain significant research funding. They explained that their main focus is on migration research, and it is by using climate change to attract funding that they could continue their work. So here we see also how climate change as a spice is directly implicated in discussions on mobilities. And in the longer paper, I also discuss how the slow violence of salinization and how shrimp cultivation has contributed to migration for a long time. The main point is to separate migration caused by environmental degradation and broken embankments resulting from shrimp farming from climate-induced migration. And it's a very complex thing to disentangle. Another thing is that climate reductive translations may also misread circular migration. Seasonal labor migration is a historical practice in South Asia and is an important source of income for rural Bangladeshi villages. Circular migration has always been and remains an important part of rural livelihood strategies in Bengal, particularly among men, with their households remaining in the rural areas, receiving remittances and raising children who go to schools. And that's why also any discussion about climate migrants and climate refugees tend to make it seem like it's a forced one-off thing, but actually migration is part of livelihood strategies. And then finally, to talk about misreading gender displacement, my ethnography with landless single mothers shows that women's ability to migrate depended on their access to kinship-based social reproductive support at home to take care of their children and to have personal contacts to facilitate safe migration. Jasmine was raised in a female-headed household along with her 8 sisters and 2 youngest brothers in Lonnandodi, where she had returned with her now adolescent daughter. She was very enthusiastic about migrating to the brick kilns after her temporary road project ended. She had a secret extramarital partner whom she could live together with at the brick kilns, and where they would live as a husband and wife, while her studious daughter was taken care of by her mother, sisters, and younger sisters-in-law. Love shaped her motivation to migrate, while ensuring personal security among strangers in patriarchal spaces. Her choice to migrate was thus not climate-induced, nor was it primarily due to environmental pressures caused by tiger prawn cultivation. Unlike her colleague Lipi, her kinship relations enabled her to migrate. They could take care of her daughter in school. And to conclude, I see I'm running out of time. Climate reductive translations of migration misread the environmental push factors of migration and ignore the heterogeneity of Bangladeshi women and their differential agentative capacities, thereby failing to address policy solutions that remediate rural underemployment, floods, riverbank erosion, and salinization by aquaculture. By highlighting the disconnect between development policy discourses with everyday gendered lived experiences of socio-environmental vulnerabilities, I hope this talk can contribute to conversations that on the role anthropologists can take in discussing climate mobilities and how we should be careful to avoid climate reductive translation of migration that represents migration as caused by climate change and risks misreading socio-environmental landscapes and the multifaceted drivers of migration. Misreadings of mobility are often where rather than migration being climate reduced, women may migrate due to different reasons, as I discuss in my forthcoming paper in the Journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute. It's shaped by affective assemblages of kinship. So Bangladesh's environmental crisis goes beyond climate change, and in this talk, I've tried to illustrate the different ways in which development interventions are based on mistaken causal explanations that misread floods, food insecurity, and gendered migration. And here are just some images from my latest project on the toxicity of shipbreaking and the movement of ships and hazardous materials as part of the project life cycle of container ships. Thank you so much.